Hello fantasy map makers and TTRPG enthusiasts. My name is Chris. I go by the Dungeon Geek online and I produce fantasy maps and other TTRPG content. I have created some seamless art textures available on my website that allow you to create fantasy battle maps for whatever type of game that you want to play with your players. Today I'm going to drop this tutorial on how to use these seamless art textures, specifically the .pat files in Adobe Photoshop, and show you how you can begin making fantasy maps using these free textures. So even if you're not a Photoshop user, no need to worry. I believe that the practical theory and the extra files that come in the free downloads, which include .png files, are usable in other programs such as GIMP or Incarnate or Dungeon Draft, whatever you use to build your maps. So I hope you find this very valuable. Let's go ahead and get started. You're watching the Dungeon Geek. So first things first, let's talk about seamless textures. If you've ever made maps before, there's a chance you're already familiar with what these are. But for any of the newcomers, a texture is basically a square graphic that when it's repeated or tiled on any edge against itself, it provides a perfect or seamless connecting edge. So throughout this tutorial, you may hear me refer to them as patterns or textures, but I mean the same thing for our purposes here. Now our goal, of course, as map makers is to create realistic or natural looking terrain. And so I want to clarify that seamless doesn't necessarily mean perfection. The patterns are a lot like gift wrap or wallpaper. So when you scale them and repeat them enough, you're gonna see textures and patterns that are unnatural appear, of varying degree depending on what piece of art you're using. Especially when you start scaling things down, you're going to notice them. Part 6 of this tutorial will show you how to remedy those mishaps or the unavoidable consequences of using these textures. So to start things off, go ahead to patreon.com/thedungeongeek. Now there is no obligation to buy or become a patron on my Patreon page to get these assets. However, you do have to have a free Patreon account set up in order to access the download. So if you want a direct link, you can go to thedungeongeek.net and there's a big banner on the web page that basically will link you to the mega download where you can download 130 plus textures that are neatly organized right away. So let's go ahead and click here. You're going to want to download these 3 files, and then you're going to want to make sure that you remember where you saved them on your workstation because you're going to navigate back to them here shortly. And once we have them saved, let's go ahead and open Photoshop. Currently, I am using Adobe Photoshop CC 2023, and it is version 24.6. If at any point any updates from Adobe make any part of this tutorial incorrect, please let me know in the comments below and I might be able to make some updates to the video. Step 2, importing these seamless texture art files into Photoshop. There are some tutorials online that talk about importing textures by using the Edit menu and then bringing up the preset manager. That doesn't work for me for some reason, so I teach a different method. So follow along here, please. First thing, let's just to make things easier, create a new battle map PSD file. So for the sake of this tutorial, just copy the settings that I'm going to suggest, and if you'd like a more detailed deep dive tutorial on setting up files for battle maps, let me know in the comments and I can think about making that video. When you're making this new PSD, this new battle map file, you should use the following settings. We're going to do width 30 inches, we're going to do height 20 inches, we're going to keep it at 300 pixels per inch resolution, color mode can stay at RGB, the bit can be 8 bits, and the background can be white. I'm not going to rename this file because I'm not going to be saving it. This is just for the tutorial. Now let's go ahead and import these pad files. Most likely your toolbar does not have the patterns button toggled on. So in order to enable it, go ahead and click the window navigation button on top and then scroll down to the pop-up and make sure that the pattern option is checkmarked. Go ahead and left click it and it should appear right here on your workspace. So here it is, the pattern window here on my workspace. If you've never used it before, it should look very similar to how this one does. These here are default Adobe patterns. We can ignore them for now. Let's go ahead and load in some new ones that we downloaded from the Dungeon Geek Patreon page. At the top right-hand corner of the patterns window panel, you will see 3 stacked lines, sometimes referred to as a hamburger icon. It basically represents the options for this panel. So left click on it, it should open a drop down menu. And then while it's open, I am gonna just suggest that you make sure that you set the view option to large thumbnails if it's not already. However, you may prefer large list, which displays the pattern name next to the thumbnail image of each pattern. Now with the drop down menu open, I'm just gonna hover down to import patterns and left click. And this is gonna open up a sort of a navigation dialog box where you're going to need to navigate on your workstation to where the pat files were downloaded from the Patreon page. So once you locate the pat files, you can left click on one of them to select it and then click load to load that one in individually. Or if you'd like, you can left click, hold shift, select multiple files at once and then load, and it will load all of those folders at once. So once they're loaded, you see that each of these imported pattern files is neatly organized into pre-named folders to help you sort of keep track of what's what. You can click on the little chevron shape next to the title to expand or collapse each of these folders, and then because you have your view changed, you can see what the preview of these look like. Step 3 is placing the pattern textures onto layers. Placing patterns on layers is basically the most fundamental aspect of working with and customizing battle maps in this method, so it's incredibly easy to do. But you need to have the layers window open if you don't already. Now, just like patterns, go to the window, and drop down here, make sure that the layers area is check marked, and then you see in my workspace I've moved them around so that I have both the patterns and the layers window ready and easy to work with adjacent to each other. For the purposes of this tutorial, I'm only going to demonstrate one method of placing patterns from the pattern window onto a layer. Once you have a deep understanding of Photoshop, you'll discover various ways to do almost any task. So just trying to keep this video as concise as possible. Start by creating a new layer. Click on the Create New Layer button located down here at the bottom of the Layers window. It kind of resembles a square with a plus sign inside of it. And then once the layer is created, go back and click on a pattern in the pattern window, and voila, the selected pattern will be applied to the currently selected layer. If you want to use a different pattern, simply click on a different one, and as long as the layer is selected, selecting a pattern will change it to the selected pattern. Now, before we proceed on any detail work for this particular pattern, let's go ahead and add a few more layers with a few more different textures. Again, we just click on the New Layer button, ensure that the new layer is selected, and then click on a different pattern. We are going to select a few patterns that are kind of similar, that may be in the same biome or environment. Step 4, scaling references, rulers, and grids. These are important tools and may help you. And now that we have our two pattern textures on separate layers, we need to scale and adjust them to fit the theme or the desired outcome of your creative vision. So typically battle maps are built with square grids, and each square represents 5 feet. Therefore, it doesn't make sense for a grass pattern to basically evoke the idea that these blades of grass are 3 or 4 feet in length, unless you're doing something crazy like, you're Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, or you're in, the Fey realm or some giant land. To aid in scaling, I like to establish scale references using rulers and grids. To toggle them on, you're going to either hit left Control plus R on a PC or Command plus R on a Mac. And once they're enabled, you'll see the rulers sort of above and then here left of the workspace. For the grid, use left Control and then apostrophe on a PC, or Command plus apostrophe on a Mac, and that toggles it on and off. Keep in mind that this grid is only open and visible inside of Photoshop. You're not going to see it if you save the file out as a rasterized file like a JPEG or a PDF or something. It's just for Photoshop reference only. Additionally, there are other customization options for grids. Basically just go under Edit, Preferences, Grids, Guides, and Slices, and then you can edit things like the color or the stroke width of the guides themselves, and this can help with your design process. Step 5, scaling the patterns. So we have got our layers here, each with a pattern applied. From left to right, let's talk about the anatomy of this layer. So we've got this little eyeball icon that toggles the visibility on and off. This dark block represents the pattern fill, and the chain here indicates that there's this linked element, which happens to be this layer mask, which is currently pure white. Now, regarding layer masks, white means revealed and black means hidden. We will discuss this more shortly. All right, so I'm going to want to zoom in a little closer to the artboard by pressing left Control and the plus sign a few times, or Command plus on a Mac. And then now I'm going to double click on the pattern fill block of this layer. This will open a dialog box where you can adjust the pattern scale. In most cases, you're going to be scaling it down. If you scale it up, you may lose some quality. All right, let's try 25% initially. But keeping in mind that the grid represents 5 feet, let's even experiment further down. That should work well. Let's zoom out a bit. It's left control minus twice, or command minus on a Mac. Now, to work on scaling the other texture, we need to see that layer. The easiest option is to temporarily toggle off the layer visibility eyeball for this layer. Now, repeat the same steps for pattern fill on this one that we did previously. Double left click, adjust the scale, whatever looks best. All right, and once we're done, left control +0 or command +0 on a Mac should zoom you back to 100% view. As we discussed at the beginning of this video, you can see the tiling pattern that has come up from scaling this thing down. The effect is unavoidable, even on the best texture files. But we can address this using the layer mask. Step 6, blending patterns with layer masks. The steps before this were pretty straightforward, but this step, as far as blending patterns together, is more of an art. So take your time, experiment, and once you understand the fundamentals, you're just gonna keep getting better at it. In essence, masking allows us to control the visibility of our pattern layers as they stack on top of each other to create a net new sort of blended pattern. So what can you do to influence the results? Well, you could increase the number of layered patterns that you're using. You could select specific textures and adjust their scale or their rotation. You could also change the layer order. You could use special brushes that have specific effects as you paint over the layer masks. Speaking of painting over the layer masks only consider information in terms of black and white. So when you're painting on a mask with brushes, you're either going to be using pure black or pure white. Now, you can use softer brushes, you can up the opacity, lower the opacity, but basically understanding that white will reveal and black will hide what is currently on that layer. Let's go ahead and zoom in, and we're gonna turn the grid back on. Make sure that all the patterns are visible here in my layer stack, and then we're gonna select the top layer mask. You can see here that it is currently solid white. Okay, there it is selected, and you can actually invert this layer mask to pure black right now by pressing left control I or command I on a Mac. Inverting it turns the pure white mask black, or in the inverse would turn the pure black mask white, which basically also hides the entire pattern, even though you see that the visibility of the layer here with the eyeball is still turned on. Starting from either extreme, black or white, can save you time, so it's a good tip just to know. All right, let's go ahead and invert the layer mask back to pure white, and then we're going to select a brush, any brush really that you prefer for this tutorial, maybe something 50 pixels or something to start. And when you're practicing, feel free to experiment with different types of brushes. All of these special options that are available to the brushes, like the basic settings, even hardness, softness, opacity, the flow, they can help yield different results when you're blending your layer masks. So again, experiment, have fun. All right, since the layer mask is white, we are going to be making sure that we're painting with black. All right, we're going to select that. And then as you add the black here, just painting on the layer below becomes visible. So switching back to white will then hide those areas if you paint over it again. And so here we go. With practice, you'll be able to blend together multiple textures to create more natural looking terrain for your battle maps. Hey, that's it for today. If you've made it this far, please give yourself a pat on the back. No? Anyone? Okay. I still have plenty of tips and tricks to share. So please like this video, share it, comment. If you have any questions that you would like for me to answer, please just drop me a line. I'll get back to you. Thank you so much for joining me on this adventure. Until next time, you have been watching The Dungeon Geek.